I'll try and race through this and do it quickly and make it a bit lighthearted. This is, for those who have been listening all day, it's hard work to keep concentrating, but this is a topic which is a bit optimistic and left field, hopefully a bit of fun. The publication relevant to this is in the Indian Journal of Orthopaedic special issue, showing that cricketers in Australia, or male cricketers who have played Sheffield Shield cricket in the past in Australia, have higher longevity or lower death rates than the general population in Australia. And it's one of 3 studies. Third one is not yet published, but I'll give you a sneak preview of the data that makes it even more lighthearted. But it's an interesting topic to contemplate when we think about the issues that we discuss related to being an elite athlete. So elite athletes obviously suffer more orthopaedic problems than the general population, get more injuries. In the football codes and maybe a little bit in cricket, we worry about neurodegenerative problems from repetitive concussions. Does this translate to any deficit in life expectancy? And the short answer is no in athletes, which is great news. So the set of 3 studies that I did, the first one was actually Aussie rules, and I did talk about Aussie rules football in my talk at the workshop. That one I started during the lockdown and was looking for something to do because I was stuck at home with family and wasn't allowed to go into work or do anything. In Australia, we had some very long lockdowns. And the common technique here is using Wikipedia, and this methodology, I think, is going to be able to be replicated for any groups you want to do this for. If you've got a population that's well enough defined on Wikipedia that every member of the population has a page that's adequately curated, you can do longevity studies on that population without needing ethics because it's publicly available information. So you have to pick a population that is well enough known that everyone gets their Wikipedia page if they join that population. And Sheffield Shield cricketers ticked that box, and so did players who had played one game of AFL or its precursor VFL football. And I'm not sure whether that would apply to, say, English county cricketers or Ranji Cup cricketers in India, for example. I'm not sure how many people curate Wikipedia pages, but it's an interesting technique. There are some studies in this area that have been done with more traditional methodology where they've gone into databases and actually looked at official death certificates for various groups, and that requires a lot more work than this did. There's a pic of Shane Warne, obviously, who's a prominent cricketer death from Australia in the last year and a bit. And I've put up Keith Miller, who's an old Australian all-rounder, because he's one of the few that made the cricketers cohort and the Australian footballers cohort. He played at the top level of both sports, which is uncommon, but a handful of past players did. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, so I'd rather give you the results than go into the methods, but if you're interested in the methods, I'd encourage you to go into the Indian Journal of Orthopaedics and read them in a lot of detail. And the Aussie Rules paper was published in JSAM's Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport a year ago. But you had to be a Sheffield Shield player and have played one game. Unfortunately, we only did males because the females have only risen to prominence in the last 20 years, and we don't have good data on female players from last century. And this is a study of the players of last century, because players who have played this century generally haven't died at rates that are enough that you can show whether or not the rate's higher or lower than the general population, because people below the age of 50 or 60 don't tend to die at very high rates. But the technique we used was we calculated using the death tables that Australia's published since 1971. That's the other part you need to do a study like this. You need statistics that look at death rates by age for that population, and Australia has got them starting in 1971. So that was our chosen start date for all of these studies, because that's when we can look at the death rate for males and females in a given year. All males between 55 and 60 had a death rate of X, and we can work out, since we had certain number of cricketers in that age group, how many would we expected of that group to die each year, and then calculate whether the number who actually died in the year was higher or lower than the expected amount. So this is really busy, but this is the cricket results showing that there were only 4 years out of 52 where more cricketers died than expected, and when you go decade by decade, it was always lower. So every decade fewer cricketers died than we would have expected them to if they were representative of the general population. In other words, the cricketers were less likely to die, and the ratio was around the 0.7 mark. So on any given year, a cricketer is 30% less likely to die than a member of the general population. And that would translate to living, even though it sounds 30% less is a lot, it doesn't mean you'd live for 30% more years, because your rate of death goes exponentially up once you get past your 70s. So they probably end up living about 2 or 3 years longer than the general population for that 30% improvement they've got. But it was good news, and it was followed on from similar data in the football cohort that they were in the high 70s rather than the low 70s, so they didn't have quite the same reduced rate as cricketers, but they also were better than the general population. Another busy slide, and I'm sorry that it's going to be hard to read, but the players who died in this cricket cohort, that the two most common 5-year age groups to die in were 80 to 84 and 85 to 89. So they're living to a good age. No Sheffield Shield players got to 100 yet, but quite a few have gotten to their 90s, and there aren't that many, although we know about them because they're high profile, there aren't many in the Shane Warne category or in the Philip Hughes category that die very early. So very small numbers, which is good news. And the cohort of living ones is on the left-hand column, and it's a bit more biased towards younger players there, but again, they're not dying at very high rates. That's the Aussie rules data, again showing a 0.79 compared to the general population, which is better, a little bit higher than the cricket players. So, but not a huge difference between the two groups. And I've got a third one which I'm doing, which is fascinating as a bit of a control group because they're celebrities and they're famous, which is Australian rock and pop musicians, and they show the opposite trend. So they die earlier than the general population. And in this group, there have actually been quite a few using American musicians and European and English, and they've all shown the same thing, that musicians don't die later, they die earlier. In this group, we had a predominance of cancer in middle age, which is interesting, and cancers that may be associated with substance use, so GI tract and respiratory tract cancers. So this is a famous Australian pop musician who's recently died of breast cancer, but not too prematurely. But there was quite a lot of in this group that were dying of cancer in 40s, 50s and 60s at an age that you'd think that's quite young. So musicians have, what they've got in common with athletes is that they are famous and rich at a young age, or potentially rich, and they've got to deal with the trappings of fame, which the athletes tend to. Their careers go on a little bit longer, perhaps. They don't have to retire at a young age, and they are primarily indoor performers than outdoor performers. But I think that having this as a control group raises a question that we have the necessary evil, if we like, of anti-doping measures in sport, and maybe it's much more protective for later in life than we think, because musicians don't get subject, obviously, to any drug testing, and therefore they can, if they're wealthy enough, they can afford to dabble in illicit substances perhaps at a higher rate than the general population. And whilst we think that our athletes are likely to be naughty, the fact that they're one of the only groups in society that's getting drug tested means that they're almost certainly using at a rate lower than the general population, or particularly using at high amounts, and that's one of your most common reasons why you'll die early is overuse of illicit substances. So it's an interesting control group, and it brings up a good topic that it's a not suggesting that we'll ever get this across the line that musicians have to get drug tested and that they'll get suspended if they get found positive, because we might not have nearly as many rock concerts going on. But so I'll probably open up the floor to. Oh, actually, I'll make one more point, that we have to concede that there's a thing called the healthy worker hire effect. That's a bias implicit in this sort of study, that the general population has got 20-year-olds in it who have got cystic fibrosis or are heavily disabled. The athlete and musician populations do not have people like that, so there's always going to be a little bit of a bias towards reduced death rates, because we once you join a group like that in your early 20s, you're auto-selected to be healthy at the time. So that is one of the explanations for this phenomenon, is the healthy worker hire effect. And but the other one, which is I think is the most likely other explanation, besides the fact that you've got drug testing and you're not going to be a heavy user of illicit substances, is that we now know that exercise is a huge predictor of longevity in the general population, and I think it's a good assumption that athletes, by the fact that they're physically very fit, that they're much more likely to be lifelong exercisers, even if they're dealing with hip replacements and knee replacements, and they generally don't stop exercising. They generally have those healthy habits that they form at a young age and continue to stay physically fit. Obviously an area for more research to confirm that, but I think that this could be one of the reasons why they live to longer ages, that they don't fall into immediately sedentary habits upon retirement, or that's a theory there. So there's plenty of references there if you want to take a photo of that, that have looked at, and the results in all three of these cohorts are very consistent with other studies. There's only a couple of sporting groups that show reduced rates compared to the general populations, and they're the ones like powerlifting that have shown. There's a Finnish powerlifting study that presumably the athletes in that weren't subject to drug testing, and that they might have been high users of anabolic steroids, and they died at an earlier age. And almost all of the other athlete studies, even the NFL, show outliving of the general population. But musician studies are fairly dire in the other direction, that the musician studies tend to show dying prematurely compared to the general population in the vast majority that have been published to date. So it's interesting and just adding to the literature, but we can say at least we've got one on cricket, and it'd be nice for someone to do another country at some stage and do a comparison and have a look and see how other countries go. But I imagine it would be more good news to come, because generally I think our athletes are healthy and have good habits, and we're assisting them with the issues that they do have, but they still are a privileged group that make good use of the privilege with good life habits, and generally go on to live to a good age. Anyway, I'll open it up.